And that's the Commissar all done, ready to go smash some Xenos and heretics. Got a few more touch-ups left on the guy himself, but I'm calling this done. Nice. Alright, I'm just going to come right out and say it. If your model does not have a finished base, your model's not finished. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how I went through all the process to make this base, and then you can finish your bases, and thus finish your models. So we're going to start with a base. This is just a spare GW base I had lying around. So I've glued some bits to this already. These are from my last video that you can find right here. If you don't want to cast these, you can actually just use cork and a base string or some other kind of cable, and that'll work just fine. Then I'm going to take this I-beam or H-beam that you can get from the hobby store. This is just some plasticard. And here I'm going to take my most subpar pair of clippers because they leave a ragged edge, which is actually what I want in this instance. Now if you want, you can go a step further with this stuff and use a heat gun or a lighter and kind of bend it and twist it if you want, but I'm just going to go for some straight pieces for this base. And this wouldn't be a 40k base without some skulls! Of course, these are just the GW box of skulls that you can get. They've lasted me way longer than I thought they would. I put skulls on quite a few bases that I make. I really do like the difference in texture and color that you can get for your base. And because I'm an overachiever, I'm also going to put some bricks on this. This adds yet another color to the color palette of the base, a nice little red pop, which I really also like putting on these. These are from Secret Weapon Miniatures. They have a ton of really cool stuff, especially for basing, as well as just full-blown bases ready to go and paint. I'll leave a link in the description. And that brings us to this stuff. What is this stuff? This is actually crushed walnut shell that I got from a sewing store. I really like this over sand because it's actually porous. It'll absorb some of the glue and it tends to stick a lot better, as well as paint a lot better than sand will. And I use this twofold. I use it kind of for some crushed brick as well as just some bigger rubble. So now it's time to fill in all these gaps with some textured paste. I'm using some medium ballast from Woodland Scenics as well as some fine turf from Woodland Scenics. So I'm going to take these, I'm going to get a cup out here, and I vary how much of each I add pretty much every time I do this to give me a slightly varied texture throughout the bases. Now this is a wood glue spreader that I got from a woodworking store, which is rather convenient considering we're about to add a bunch of wood glue. You want to add enough wood glue to give you a nice kind of paste consistency. If you add too much glue, you can always add more flock or ballast. And if you add too much ballast, you can always add more wood glue, and you can make, a couple gallons of this until you finally get the correct texture. Next step here, I'm going to get another one of these little cups out, and I'm going to just put some water in it. This way I can manipulate this paste without it actually sticking to my little glue spreader. Now here's an optional step. You can add some paint into this and get this closer to the color that you're wanting to paint it in the end. I typically paint over it, so this isn't really necessary, but sometimes I like doing this anyway. So let's get to spreading. I'm going to put this in all the spots that don't have texture on it already. I use the water, like I said, to kind of push this around. And after this is kind of spread on almost flat, I normally come back and kind of poke it and give it more texture. And when I've gone all the way around, got everything done here and kind of wiped up the edges to make sure that nothing's hanging over the sides, it's time to let it dry for like a day. And then we're going to prime it. Now I'm doing this whole thing by hand. I could go to the airbrush booth and make this easier, but I'm just going to paint it on with a paintbrush to show you that you don't have to have an airbrush for any of these techniques. And once I get through all the priming stuff and make sure everything's nice and primed and let it all dry, we go into the base step. So for the first base color, I'm using Iron Hole Gray from Privateer Press. And this is a decent base color for every other color that I'm going to put onto this base, so I'm going to paint over everything with this. And once the base coat is all laid out and we've given it some time to dry, it's time for dry brushing. Now this is Frostbite, again from Privateer Press. If you want to do those Games Workshop paints instead, I would suggest Mechanica Standard Gray and Fenrisian Gray for the dry brush. I'm going to dry brush all over this thing to make sure all of the texture is picked out. Now you can dry brush a little more or a little less in different places as well to give it a more varied look. And now we're going to pick out all the metallics in Privateer Press Cold Steel. This is basically lead belcher if you want to go Games Workshop route. And we're just going to go through and pick out the little cable here and the H-beams or I-beams. Metallic is really nice to add to the base, especially for a ruined city, just to give a nice pop. On to the bricks. Now I'm actually just going to straight up use Games Workshop for this. This is Corn Red, but we're going to mix it with a P3 paint called Moldy Ochre. If you look at bricks, they don't tend to all be the same color of red, so I tend to mix up a color for pretty much each individual brick just to give a nice variation and have some like accent colors. Once all the bricks are cut in, it's onto the skulls. Now this is Sickly Skin. This is a privateer press paint that I highly recommend. It tends to go on really smooth and is a great base coat for pretty much any bright color, yellows, whites, and it's a really good color for skulls. And I decided to come back in and use Beast Hide from Privateer Press yet again to cut in this hair on the Kroot. Do Kroot have hair? Whatever this spiny stuff is on the Kroot. I'm painting that. Beast Hide. Now this is definitely an optional step. This is Tamiya's masking paper. So this has a grid on it so you can cut out little lines or designs or whatever you need. I'm going to use this to put the road markings on the road. So I'm just going to go a couple squares across and however many squares down feels right. Using the lines to kind of keep everything straight, and I'm totally using the center of the paper because I like to waste things. So I'll cut that far side off and hopefully I'll find some use for it later. And now I'm just going to kind of test fit this. And as I was test fitting it, right before I finished peeling off the backing, I realized maybe I want a second dash. Do I want a second dash? I think I do. At least this stuff is rather forgiving. So I'm just going to take it off, put it back on the backing paper, count a few squares down, and kind of cut out another little dash that's going to go on here. And I'm going to line the end of that dash up so that the paper covers, so the dash is only on the cement and not just on some random rubble. So now we get to painting with masking. So if I just slap paint on here at full thickness, it's going to leak underneath it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to base this with just straight up white here, and I'm going to give it a few almost dry brushes. Like it's going to have a little bit more paint than a dry brush would, but I'm definitely going to keep it pretty dry so I don't have any leaking underneath this paper. So once we have a couple coats of white down, I'm going to come in with a yellow. I'm just going to use this paper as kind of a bit of a palette, and I'm going to do the same basic thing. We're going to kind of dry brush this in, keeping the paint dry, doing multiple passes with the paintbrush, doing multiple coats until we get a nice strong yellow. And once the yellow is all done, I'm actually going to peel this off with the paint still ever so slightly wet. I feel like I get a better line that way and it doesn't pull up any of the dry paint. That brings us to washes. I actually use all three of these. I'm using Null Oil, Adrax Earthshade, and Camo Shade all on this base, and I use them all at the same time. That way I get kind of a blend between each of them, so I get different color modulation in different parts of the base, but there's also a smooth blending between the two different types of colors. And this goes over everything. This brings the whole base together and gives it a nice wash that ties every different color on this base together so they have a similar tone. Now we just have to paint the rim on the base. Now, some people insist on painting them black. I don't like black rims on bases for whatever reason. I'm always painting it something that's on the base. So I'm using the Iron Hull Gray and just going around the rim with just this. And once we get around the rim of this base, most people would call this done, but I'm going to go one step even further. These are the Secret Weapon weathering pigments, and I'm just going to take some isopropyl alcohol. This is 90%, so I'm actually going to thin it with some water as well. The alcohol is going to be there to reduce the surface tension so it flows a little bit better, but you need to be careful with it because it will eat your paint. So I'm using Rust Red and Dark Earth, and I'm just going to go over any of the metallic bits here to give them a nice little rust effect. One of the big advantages of pigments over paint is you can get a little bit more of a give and take, so you can put some on and kind of wipe some off and get it right where you want it. And here we are with a completed base. It's looking good. It just needs a model to go on top of it. Well, I hope you liked this video. I hope you've learned something. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching.